Here's a short, punchy hook for your story. I came for my friend, but she looked at me like I was already hers. Or, for a slightly more teasing angle, she smiled and whispered, "You're playing with fire, honey," and just like that, I was hooked. If you want, I can craft 5 more ultra-hooky options that are perfect for YouTube thumbnails and short intros. The evening had started like any other. I stepped through the familiar front door of my friend's house, expecting the usual chaos of laughter, chatter, and the faint aroma of something cooking in the kitchen. The golden glow of the living room lights gave everything a cozy warmth, yet there was a subtle electricity in the air, something that made me pause without understanding why. I had come to see my friend, to reconnect over old jokes and shared memories. That was the plan. But then I noticed her, not at first with intent, just a flicker at the corner of my eye. She moved through the room with a quiet elegance, the kind of presence that doesn't demand attention but inevitably pulls it anyway. Her steps were measured, graceful, each motion deliberate yet effortless. There was a subtle sway in the way she walked, a soft clink of jewelry, a warmth in her smile that seemed to touch everyone she passed. And then our eyes met. It wasn't shock, exactly, more like recognition. A strange jolt that traveled through me, making me feel both alert and disarmed at the same time. She tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering in her gaze, and then turned away as if nothing had happened, but the faint echo of her warmth lingered long after she left my line of sight. I tried to remind myself of the obvious. She was my friend's mom. That should have been enough to steady my racing thoughts. But her presence was disarming, subtle in a way that made the ordinary feel alive. Her perfume was faint but lingering, a warm blend of florals and something comforting, like sunlight filtering through late afternoon curtains. She moved naturally, helping in the kitchen, laughing quietly at jokes, yet somehow every gesture felt like it carried a hidden weight meant just for me. There was a moment in the hallway when our hands brushed while reaching for the same serving bowl. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it left a tingle that lingered far longer than it should have. I caught myself analyzing her, feeling a mix of guilt and fascination. How could someone be so effortless, so real, and still make an entire room revolve around the small orbit of their presence? The evening stretched on, but I couldn't shake it. I had come to hang out with my friend, to enjoy a casual night, yet somehow the world seemed to narrow around her. Every laugh she gave, every tilt of her head, every fleeting glance felt intimate, almost conspiratorial. I realized, with both fear and excitement, that I was noticing her in ways I shouldn't, and part of me didn't want to stop. By the time I sank into the couch, the pull of her presence had become undeniable. I was mesmerized, caught between fascination and guilt, captivated by someone I shouldn't even be thinking about this way. And deep down, I sensed that this was just the beginning, an ember of something that would grow, quietly, inexorably, into a connection I couldn't yet name, but couldn't ignore. The first keynote had set the spark, but now it was burning quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the corners of the room. I moved through the evening with the intention of being present for my friend, yet every glance toward her, every accidental brush of hands, made that intention waver. It was as if the universe had conspired to create moments designed to unsettle me. Small, fleeting interactions that felt both innocent and charged with something far more potent. She appeared in the kitchen while I was fumbling with a snack tray, pretending to offer help. Our hands met over a bowl, lightly, but long enough that I felt an unexpected warmth spread from my fingers to my chest. She didn't pull away. Her smile was soft, teasing almost imperceptibly, but grounded, real. In that moment, I realized how dangerous this was. The pull she exerted didn't come from bold gestures or deliberate flirting. It came from something subtler, something ineffably magnetic. I found myself analyzing everything. The curve of her fingers, the tilt of her head when she laughed, the way her shoulders relaxed yet carried quiet authority. She moved through the room with grace, attending to others, while somehow making me feel like the only one she truly noticed. There was a rhythm to her presence, a quiet push and pull that left me unsettled, fascinated, and, admittedly, terrified of how much I was drawn to her. Later, in the living room, our paths crossed again. I reached for a magazine at the same time as she did. Our fingers brushed once more, this time deliberately longer, though subtle enough that no one else would notice. My pulse quickened, my chest tightened, and I became acutely aware of the space between us. She didn't flinch, didn't shy away. Instead, she offered a knowing, almost imperceptible smile, as if silently acknowledging the tension simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't overt, it wasn't dramatic. It was in the soft laugh she let slip when I made a clumsy joke, the gentle tilt of her head as she studied my reaction, the way her eyes lingered a fraction too long before moving away. Each interaction was minuscule on its own, almost forgettable, but together they built a current I couldn't resist. I realized that attraction didn't always announce itself with bold gestures. Sometimes it crept in quietly, threading its way through touches, glances, and shared silences. By the time I sank into a chair again, I was painfully aware of her presence. I wanted to look away, to ground myself, to remind myself of boundaries. But each accidental brush, each fleeting exchange, made it impossible. My thoughts oscillated between guilt and fascination, guilt for noticing her, fascination for noticing everything about her. I had come for my friend, yet the night had become something entirely different, an exploration of a tension I had neither anticipated nor understood. And through it all, her calm confidence never faltered. She seemed entirely unaware of the effect she had. Or perhaps she was acutely aware, choosing subtlety over spectacle. Either way, the magnetism was undeniable. I was drawn into her orbit, unwilling to escape, knowing already that the slow burn had begun. The night had settled into a rhythm, soft laughter and the clatter of dishes fading into the background of the house. I was still there for my friend, or at least I told myself that, but every glance in her direction reminded me of how impossible it was to focus. She appeared in the kitchen again, moving with that effortless grace that seemed to bend the room to her presence. Barefoot on the carpet, hair loosely tied, she carried a mug of tea, and somehow even that mundane act felt intimate, electrified by proximity. I followed instinctively, offering to help with snacks or plates, though it was obvious my help was barely needed. Our hands brushed over the same bowl, and the sensation lingered, spreading warmth up my arm. My pulse quickened. She smiled, soft and teasing, yet entirely natural, as if aware of the effect she had without needing to force it. That smile, small, deliberate, magnetic, pulled me further into her orbit. "You're playing with fire, honey," she said, voice low, teasing, almost conspiratorial. The words struck me like a soft spark against dry tinder, igniting a rush of awareness that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't a joke, though it could have been taken as one. It was a statement, a recognition of the tension that had been building quietly between us all evening. I froze, caught somewhere between shock, guilt, and a thrill I hadn't felt before. The teasing wasn't vulgar or overt. It was layered with subtlety, a delicate acknowledgement of desire without crossing lines. Her eyes held mine, steady and confident, and in them I saw an understanding, a silent admission that she knew as well as I did that the connection simmering between us was real. The air seemed to thicken around us, the kitchen dimly lit, yet every detail of her face, her posture, her slight smirk burned into my attention. I wanted to laugh, to brush it off, to retreat to safety, but there was something intoxicating about the playfulness, the quiet danger. It was the kind of moment that demanded presence, that refused casual dismissal. I noticed the small things, the curve of her fingers as she held the mug, the soft rise of her eyebrows, the tilt of her head, and felt a jolt each time my gaze met hers. Every gesture was deliberate, yet unforced, designed to draw me in without a single word of seduction. For the first time that evening, I felt fully aware of the invisible thread between us. It wasn't physical, at least not in any overt sense, but it was magnetic, a slow pull that had been accumulating with each accidental touch, each fleeting glance. And now, with her teasing words, it was undeniable. I felt it in my chest, a quiet fire that warmed and terrified me at the same time. The rest of the kitchen faded. The clinking of plates, the faint music, the laughter elsewhere in the house, all became background noise to the moment that existed only between us. We were alone in the quiet intensity of acknowledgement, caught in the delicate tension of what could be, what shouldn't be, and what we both silently knew we wanted. And yet, she didn't step closer. She didn't reach out. She simply let the words linger, let the glance stretch, letting me sit with the realization that the fire she warned about was already burning, and I had no choice but to feel it. After that moment in the kitchen, everything changed. Even the mundane felt charged. Each glance, each small brush of hands, carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I moved through the house with the pretense of helping my friend, but my attention was drawn constantly to her. She seemed to glide through the evening effortlessly, yet every casual gesture, reaching for a snack, laughing softly at a comment, adjusting her hair, felt like it had been orchestrated to keep me aware of her presence. We weren't speaking directly all the time, yet a silent language had formed between us. Eyes met across rooms, hands brushed over shared objects, and there was a shared rhythm to our movements. She would linger just slightly longer than necessary when handing me something, or let her gaze settle a fraction of a second longer than usual. Small, almost negligible moments, but together they were undeniable. The tension wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a current, subtle, and persistent, tugging me toward her without any overt push. Even the casual touches became laden with meaning. A hand resting on the counter while she explained something, the slight brush of our shoulders as we passed in the hallway, a fleeting contact of fingers over a plate. Each one left an imprint of awareness. My pulse quickened in response, my chest tightening in ways I didn't expect. I became conscious of every detail, the warmth of her skin, the calm confidence in her voice, the subtle playfulness in her smile. And I noticed, almost reluctantly, how aware she was of me in return. There was no overt flirtation, no bold declaration, just an acknowledgement in her eyes, a steady magnetism that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. It was intoxicating. I felt simultaneously exhilarated and guilty, aware that my attention was no longer entirely on my friend or the evening's purpose. The slow pull of her presence made it impossible to stay grounded. I caught myself imagining scenarios that never occurred, dwelling on what might happen if she leaned closer, if our hands lingered a moment longer. Each thought made my pulse race, and each accidental touch seemed deliberate, though neither of us broke the unspoken boundaries we both understood. Yet she remained calm, entirely unruffled by the effect she had on me. It was as though she had mastered the art of controlled tension, aware of the pull she created, yet restrained enough to let it simmer. That control only made her more magnetic. I was drawn in, helplessly aware of the danger in the attraction, but equally unable to resist it. By the end of the evening, the slow burn had intensified. What had started as curiosity and fleeting awareness had grown into something more complex, a subtle, intoxicating dance of restraint, attention, and unspoken desire. Every glance, every brush of fingers, every shared laugh reinforced it. The connection between us was no longer casual or accidental. It was deliberate in its own understated way. And I realized, with a mixture of fear and fascination, that this was only the beginning. The pull was growing stronger, the moments more charged, and I knew the coming days would be filled with an awareness that neither of us could, or would, ignore. The slow burn was becoming impossible to deny. Days passed, and every visit seemed to carry the same quiet intensity. I went over under the guise of seeing my friend, but the unspoken tension between us had begun to shape the rhythm of the house. Each encounter was measured, delicate, every glance, every brush of hands, every accidental closeness a thread weaving us closer. It was a slow burn, subtle but persistent, growing stronger with every shared space. One evening, we found ourselves in the living room together while my friend was distracted with something in the kitchen. She settled onto the couch, casually, but the atmosphere shifted. The warm lamplight fell across her features, softening her expressions and accentuating the gentle strength I had noticed since the first night. Her presence seemed to command the room without effort, yet she made it feel intimate, personal, and just for me. We began talking lightly at first, mundane topics, small details of our days, trivial jokes, but didn't stay light for long. Slowly, the conversation deepened. She shared a story from her 20s, a lesson learned through both mistake and triumph. And I found myself listening intently, not just to the words but to the subtle cadence of her voice. There was a confidence in her tone, tempered by a vulnerability she didn't try to hide. It made her real, approachable, human, but still somehow untouchable in a way that made my pulse quicken. We discovered an unexpected rhythm in our interactions. A laugh, a shared memory, a fleeting glance became a quiet conversation all its own. She noticed me in ways no one else did, attuned to my reactions, aware of when I hesitated, when I lingered on a thought. Each moment, however small, carried a weight I had never anticipated. I felt tethered to her in ways that were emotional as much as physical. The subtle rise of a shoulder, the tilt of her head, the soft fall of her hair as she leaned closer to reach for a book. Our hands brushed occasionally, not boldly, but enough to leave a lingering awareness. The contact wasn't provocative, yet each accidental touch seemed intentional in its effect. I noticed the warmth of her skin, the subtle strength in her fingers, and the quiet reassurance she radiated without words. There was no need for confession, no need for dramatic gestures. Our connection had become a language of small movements, shared silences, and attentive observation. By the end of the evening, I realized the pull between us had grown beyond mere curiosity or attraction. It was deeper, more intricate, a slow-burning flame of emotional awareness, mutual recognition, and restrained desire. I was aware of her completely in a way that went beyond surface attraction. And I sensed she was equally aware, equally present, and equally captivated by the tension between us. It wasn't reckless or dangerous in the overt sense, but it was undeniably powerful. A shared glance could make my chest tighten. A brief brush of fingers could leave me dizzy. We had created a quiet world of understanding between us, one that existed beneath the ordinary, threaded through with anticipation, fascination, and a sense of unspoken promise. And as I left that night, walking back into the world outside the warm cocoon of her presence, I understood something crucial. This slow burn was no longer a spark. It was becoming a steady flame, quiet but undeniable, and it was only going to grow. The days following our first deep conversation carried a quiet electricity. Every visit, every accidental meeting seemed choreographed by some invisible force, as if the house itself was aware of the tension simmering between us. It wasn't overt, no loud declarations, no dramatic confrontations, but the subtle gestures and shared glances had become a language all their own. I found myself waiting, almost unconsciously, for those moments when our paths would cross in a way that made the world feel smaller. One evening, the opportunity presented itself. My friend had retreated to his room, leaving the living room empty except for her. She was perched on the edge of the couch, hair loose, eyes bright, holding a book she wasn't reading. She was simply present. The quiet poise she carried drew me in immediately, and I felt the magnetic pull that had become impossible to resist. The space between us was charged, almost palpable, and I realized that everything in the house had faded away. Nothing existed except this moment and her. I sat down across from her, careful of the distance, yet unable to ignore the draw toward her. Our conversation began lightly, casual remarks about trivial things, but the underlying current was impossible to ignore. Each word, each laugh, Each subtle shift of posture carried an unspoken weight. The glances we exchanged lingered, speaking volumes where our words remained careful and measured. I was acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her, the softness in her eyes, the tiny gestures that made the air between us electric. Then she leaned forward, adjusting the book in her lap, and the faint brush of her fingers against mine as she set it down sent a jolt straight through me. I froze, conscious of the pulse in my chest, and the way my heart seemed to leap at the contact. Her eyes met mine, steady and unflinching, and in them I saw acknowledgement. It wasn't flirtation in the traditional sense. There was no audacity, no demand. It was awareness, recognition of the tension we had both been cultivating quietly over weeks, now undeniable. "You're playing with fire, honey," she said again, soft, teasing, yet layered with certainty. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a joke. It was a declaration, a quiet statement that what had been simmering between us was real, mutual, and understood. My pulse raced, my mind scrambled to reconcile desire and guilt, and yet I couldn't look away. She didn't need to take a step closer. The words alone drew me in, framing the invisible line between us in sharp, irresistible relief. The kitchen, or the living room, or the quiet space between us, had transformed into something private, charged with intention and restraint. We were aware of the boundaries, yet the pull of proximity, the intimacy of subtle gestures, made it clear that we were both willing to linger in this tension, to explore it slowly, carefully, without shattering the decorum that defined our world. By the end of the evening, I realized that this was no longer just attraction. It was a connection, deep, potent, and profoundly human. The slow burn had reached a threshold where acknowledgement alone was enough to set the room alight with possibility. And I understood, with a mixture of exhilaration and apprehension, that nothing would ever be the same again. The following evening carried with it a quiet anticipation, a sense that everything that had been building over days and weeks was coalescing into a single, charged moment. I arrived at the house under the usual pretense, visiting my friend, but the subtle awareness between us had grown so strong it was impossible to ignore. Even before I crossed the threshold, I felt the pull, that magnetic tension that had become impossible to resist. She was already in the living room when I entered, sitting on the couch with her legs tucked beneath her, a soft lamp casting a warm glow across her features. The familiarity of her presence was comforting, yet electrifying, like stepping into a room that was simultaneously safe and dangerously alive. I settled beside her, careful to respect the space between us, yet aware of how close we already were in energy, in attention, in shared understanding. We didn't speak immediately. There was no need. The silence itself was alive with meaning. Our eyes met frequently, lingering just long enough to communicate what words could not. The world outside that room, the chatter of the house, the distant hum of traffic, faded to a soft murmur, leaving us suspended in a quiet intimacy. The slow burn that had been simmering was now steady, warm, undeniable. Our hands found each other naturally, without ceremony. The warmth of her skin seeped into mine, grounding me in a way nothing else had. Fingers intertwined tentatively at first, then with increasing certainty, as if both of us were finally allowing ourselves to acknowledge what had been quietly building. The touch wasn't passionate. It was tender, patient, and filled with meaning. Every brush of fingers, every subtle movement, conveyed layers of trust, curiosity, and mutual recognition. We spoke softly, voices low, sharing small truths and personal details we hadn't before. Childhood memories, little fears, tiny regrets. They came out in fragments, shared slowly, deliberately. And in that exchange, the connection deepened. She wasn't just a presence that captivated me. She was someone I could talk to, someone I could see clearly and honestly. The subtle tension of the past days had evolved into something richer, a bond threaded through with empathy, warmth, and quiet understanding. Every glance, every brush of hands, Every gentle laugh was a confirmation. The connection was mutual. There was no rush, no need for dramatic declarations, just a patient acknowledgement of what had grown between us. I realized that desire wasn't only about attraction. It was about awareness, about presence, about being seen and seeing someone fully. And in that awareness, the slow burn had matured into a steady flame. When it was time to leave, her hand lingered in mine just a fraction longer than necessary. Our eyes met, holding a wealth of unspoken words. There was anticipation, promise, and understanding. This was only the beginning, and the journey ahead would be slow, tender, and profoundly human. Walking out into the night air, I felt lighter, yet fully awake to the pull that had begun quietly and now promised something enduring. The slow burn had arrived at its first, tender climax, not through drama or speed, but through patience, subtlety, and mutual acknowledgement. And I knew, without a doubt, that what we shared was real, fragile, and intoxicatingly alive.